January 17, 1944. The frostbite of winter clings to the Eastern Front, biting through layers of uniform and skin. Dawn barely pierces the horizon, a gray smear over snow-choked fields. Somewhere in the distance, a faint thud grows into a rolling thunder. Artillery shells cutting through the frozen air, one after another, relentless, unyielding. In a shallow foxhole, a German infantryman grips his rifle, knuckles white, eyes darting over the frozen mud and shattered trees around him. Each explosion rattles the earth beneath, sending tremors through his chest, twisting the air with smoke and dust. The smell of cordite, blood, and frost mingles in a choking haze. Nearby, comrades crouch low, faces drawn and pale, muttering prayers or curses under their breath. Orders come and go, meaningless against the ceaseless hammering. Every passing second feels like an eternity, every impact a reminder of vulnerability. The ground heaves and shatters, and in that moment, a grim understanding settles. There is no pause, no respite, only the thunderous storm that will not end. From this unyielding chaos, the true horror of modern artillery warfare begins to reveal itself. By early 1944, the German army was facing a war on multiple fronts. The Eastern Front, a vast expanse of forests, rivers, and snow-laden plains, had become a grinding battlefield of attrition. Following the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 and the subsequent failure of the German summer offensive at Kursk, the Wehrmacht was forced into a defensive posture. Every mile of territory now required more men, more equipment, and more coordination, yet resources were dwindling. Soviet forces, bolstered by growing industrial capacity and experience, were methodically preparing a series of offensives aimed at pushing the Germans westward. German infantry divisions were stretched thin. Soldiers were rotated through the front lines as quickly as possible, but the constant strain of combat, hunger, and exposure to harsh weather eroded both physical endurance and morale. Artillery, which had long been a decisive tool of the Wehrmacht, had shifted in this period from an offensive weapon to a means of defense and psychological control. German soldiers knew that when the thunder started, it was no longer a mere barrage. It was a signal that the battlefield had already been chosen by the enemy. The Soviets, understanding the power of sustained artillery, invested heavily in quantity and quality. Across the front, thousands of guns were positioned behind hills, forests, and riverbanks, often hidden from German reconnaissance. The standard array included 76.2 mm divisional guns, 122 mm howitzers, and a heavier 152 mm corps-level artillery. But it wasn't just the caliber or range that made the Soviet artillery so effective. It was the coordination. Radio communication and meticulous mapping allowed entire batteries to fire in unison, saturating German positions with shells in carefully calculated patterns. The Germans would later describe it as a storm without end, each explosion merging into the next, leaving no moment of silence to recover or reorganize. Winter on the Eastern Front only amplified the effect. Snow-covered landscapes reflected sound, magnifying the impact of each detonation. Frozen earth prevented shells from embedding, causing many to shatter upon contact and scattered deadly fragments across wide areas. Trenches, dug in haste, offered limited protection. Foxholes filled quickly with snow, while frostbite and fatigue weakened the soldiers' ability to react. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Those wounded often waited hours, sometimes days, before receiving treatment, amplifying the psychological pressure on those still fighting. German leadership understood the strategic stakes. Army Group Center, defending critical sectors, relied on artillery observation posts and counter-battery fire to mitigate the Soviet advantage. Yet the rapid pace of Soviet operations, combined with superior numbers, made effective counterbarges nearly impossible. Reports from divisional commanders frequently noted the demoralizing effect of continuous shelling. Soldiers were not just fighting the enemy. They were fighting the sound, the vibrations, and the ever-present fear of sudden annihilation. On the logistical side, maintaining artillery fire required a monumental effort. Ammunition depots were built far from the front to avoid enemy destruction, then transported over precarious railways and snow-laden roads. Soviet engineers dug roads, reinforced bridges, and camouflage batteries to allow uninterrupted firing. Each shell fired was part of a larger, relentless plan to exhaust, confuse, and eventually break the German lines. For the soldiers in the trenches, these logistical details mattered little. They only felt the results, earth-shattering detonations that shook the ground, trees, and mines alike. Even when the Germans managed to launch counterattacks or reposition troops, they were invariably greeted by renewed bombardment. Patterns of fire were designed to follow troop movements, anticipating routes of reinforcement and retreat. The result was a continuous cycle of fear and destruction. Soldiers described it as being trapped in a tunnel where the walls themselves were alive with explosions. Every night brought uneasy sleep punctuated by distant thuds that grew louder, closer, until the dawn revealed the same shattered terrain, mangled equipment, and weary comrades. By this stage of the war, it was clear artillery had evolved beyond a tactical weapon. It had become an instrument of psychological warfare. German soldiers' letters and diaries repeatedly mentioned this storm that never stops, the earth trembling like the wrath of gods, and the fear that lives inside the chest, unshakable. It was no longer about holding a line. It was about enduring. For how long? Nobody could say. By the midwinter of 1944, German positions on the Eastern Front had become a mosaic of frozen trenches, shattered forests, and cratered fields. Soldiers awoke to landscapes that seemed unrecognizable from the day before. Trees stripped bare by artillery, snow churned into mud and blood, the horizon dotted with jagged silhouettes of destroyed bunkers. Every step carried the risk of falling into a shell crater. Every breath a reminder of the omnipresent threat overhead. Artillery fire was no longer sporadic. It was an unbroken rhythm, a relentless drumbeat that defined life and death. Daily routines were subordinated entirely to survival. Food and water were delivered under constant threat, often delayed or lost to bombardments. Soldiers slept in foxholes or bunkers hastily dug into frozen ground, where the cold was as lethal as the shells above. Diaries from the period describe men huddled together for warmth, whispering words of reassurance while the earth shook around them. Fear was compounded by uncertainty. The next shell could fall meters away or directly on top of them. This randomness created a constant state of hypervigilance, leaving soldiers both exhausted and emotionally frayed. Tactically, German units attempted to adapt. Trenches were reinforced with timber and sandbags. Decoy positions were constructed to mislead enemy targeting. Counter-battery fire became a priority, with observation posts noting muzzle flashes and shell trajectories to determine enemy positions. Yet, even with precision fire, Soviet artillery maintained overwhelming numerical superiority. Batteries could sustain firing for hours or days on end, switching positions faster than German forces could calculate. The result was a sense of futility. No matter how carefully a unit prepared, the bombardment seemed inevitable, unstoppable. The psychological toll was profound. Letters sent home reveal a recurring theme. The men were terrified, not just of death, but of the sound itself. One soldier wrote of the ground screaming under us, the sky tearing apart, the earth moving like it has a pulse of its own. Shell shock, though not yet clinically defined as it would be in later decades, was evident. Many soldiers exhibited tremors, mutinous, or compulsive behaviors during or after bombardment. Officers struggled to maintain discipline, aware that fear could erode cohesion faster than any enemy attack. The technological dimension of the artillery campaign was equally decisive. Soviet batteries employed a mix of conventional high-explosive shells and specialized munitions, including fragmentation and incendiary rounds. Coordination between infantry and artillery allowed for creeping barges that advanced in calculated increments, forcing German units to retreat or risk annihilation. Mortars and rocket artillery, such as the famous Katyusha launchers, added a new layer of terror, their howling approach heralding imminent destruction. For the soldiers, the precision mattered less than the sensation. Earth ripped apart, metal splintering, shrapnel whistling past. German leadership attempted to mitigate these effects through rotations and reserves, but these measures often fell short. Divisions were overextended, communications disrupted by shelling, and reinforcements delayed or destroyed en route. Commanders emphasized discipline and obedience, issuing orders to hold positions at all costs. Yet the reality on the ground was chaotic. Soldiers often acted independently, seeking cover, moving laterally along trenches, or digging new positions under fire. Reports from frontline units highlight a recurring pattern. Morale plummeted not after defeat, but after hours or days under unrelenting bombardment. In addition to the immediate human cost, artillery shaped the very environment of the battlefield. Fields were rendered impassable, supply lines destroyed, forests reduced to splintered stumps. Vehicles became easy targets, and tanks struggled to maneuver through cratered ground. Every explosion altered the terrain, forcing constant tactical recalculation. Engineers worked feverishly to repair roads and bridges, but the pace of Soviet shelling often rendered their efforts moot. The combination of physical destruction, constant noise, and psychological strain created a frontline experience unlike any other. Soldiers were trapped in a rhythm of anticipation and reaction, unable to rest, plan, or recover. Survival depended not only on training, but on endurance, on the ability to withstand the sensory assault of the artillery storm. This relentless pressure set the stage for a multifaceted exploration of the phenomenon. To understand the full impact, we must examine the experience from several angles: human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy strategy, and the moral dimension. Each provides insight into why German soldiers were so profoundly affected by artillery and how it came to dominate the battlefield. For the soldiers caught in the endless artillery storm, survival became an act of endurance rather than combat. The thunder of shells created a ceaseless backdrop to every movement. Men spoke of the ground shaking like a living thing, and windows in the sky opening to let fire rain down. Each detonation forced a choice: stay in the open and risk death, or hunker down in trenches that offered scant protection. Sleep was fractured. Dreams were invaded by explosions and screams from the front lines. Food and water became secondary concerns, the body's basic needs overshadowed by the instinct to survive the next impact. Letters from soldiers described the mental strain with remarkable clarity. One infantryman wrote, "We lie flat, counting the seconds between each boom, praying it lands elsewhere. There is no rest, only a heartbeat that matches the earth's tremor." Comrades became lifelines, their presence a fragile tether to sanity. The camaraderie forged in such conditions was both intimate and desperate. Trust was essential, but even the closest bonds could fray under prolonged terror. Fear was omnipresent, but so too was a grim determination. the hope that endurance might carry them through another day of unrelenting fire. Artillery dictated the tactics of both defense and survival. German units quickly learned that rigid positions were liabilities. Trenches had to be constantly modified, sometimes several times a day, to avoid areas targeted by observed barges. Decoy positions were established to mislead enemy artillery, but these offered only temporary reprieve. Observation posts and spotters attempted to track the fall of shells to adjust counterfire, yet Soviet mobility and volume of fire often rendered these efforts futile. Cohesion became a balancing act between following orders and improvising in the face of immediate danger. Small unit leaders were forced to make split-second decisions: when to hold, when to retreat, when to abandon heavy equipment in favor of survival. The incessant bombardment created pockets of isolation, with platoons or squads cut off by destroyed trenches or shell-cratered terrain. Tactical manuals could not fully prepare men for the improvisation required under constant fire. Every defensive measure was temporary. Every movement risked exposure. The battlefield became a labyrinth, defined more by explosions than by maps or strategy. Artillery in 1944 had reached a level of precision and lethality that changed warfare itself. The Soviets employed thousands of pieces of artillery along the front, ranging from divisional 76.2 mm guns to heavy 152 mm howitzers capable of leveling entire buildings. Mortars and Katyusha rocket launchers added speed and unpredictability, saturating targets with explosive force. Innovations like proximity fuses allowed shells to detonate above trenches, showering soldiers with shrapnel without requiring direct hits. From the German perspective, these technological advantages were overwhelming. Counter-battery fire was limited by range, mobility, and timing. The constant threat forced units to disperse, reducing the effectiveness of coordinated defense. Vehicles became vulnerable, supply convoys slowed to avoid destruction, and attempts to reinforce positions were frequently repelled before they could reach the front line. Technology thus became both a physical and psychological weapon. Even when no one was killed, the knowledge of its potential was enough to instill terror. Soldiers described listening for the faint whistle of incoming shells, knowing that in mere seconds, the air itself could be fatal. The human, tactical, and technological angles reveal a battlefield where endurance, improvisation, and fear were as decisive as any combat maneuver. Yet these perspectives alone cannot explain the full impact. Leadership decisions, enemy strategy, and moral consequences further shaped the experience of German soldiers under unrelenting artillery fire. Commanders on the German side faced unprecedented challenges. Artillery had transformed the battlefield into a dynamic, lethal environment where traditional control methods were often ineffective. Orders from battalion or regimental HQs frequently arrived late or never reached frontline units, delayed by destroyed communication lines or disrupted courier routes. Leaders had to rely on intuition, experience, and rapid decision-making. The smallest miscalculation could lead to catastrophic losses. Officers were acutely aware of the psychological impact on their men. Reports from the Eastern Front repeatedly mention shaken morale as a consequence of relentless shelling. Commanders tried to enforce rotation schedules, moving units out of the most dangerous sectors when possible, but logistics and limited manpower often made such measures impractical. High-ranking officers had to balance the strategic imperative of holding critical positions with the human cost of maintaining them. Some documented frustration at being powerless to shield soldiers from an enemy weapon whose scale and precision exceeded anything they had previously faced. Leadership, in these circumstances, was as much about managing fear as directing fire. The relentless artillery barges were not random. Soviet planners understood the psychological and tactical value of continuous shelling. Offensives were meticulously coordinated, with artillery serving as both hammer and guide for infantry and armor. Intelligence gathering through aerial reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and local informants enabled accurate targeting. Batteries were rotated systematically, ensuring near-constant pressure on German positions while minimizing wear on individual units. The Soviets also exploited terrain, using hills, forests, and riverbanks to conceal their guns, making counter-battery fire difficult. Artillery was often integrated with combined arms tactics. Barrages would soften defenses, disrupt supply lines, and create confusion before infantry or armored assaults. From the German perspective, the enemy seemed omnipresent, each shell reinforcing the impression of inescapable pressure. This methodical application of force was a strategic choice, intended not only to seize territory, but to erode the Germans' will to resist, turning psychological attrition into a weapon as lethal as bullets or bombs. Endless bombardment had profound effects on the moral fabric of German units. Soldiers became trapped in a state of constant anxiety, unable to predict when or where the next explosion would strike. Letters home often depict men questioning not only their own survival, but the purpose of their struggle. A recurring phrase in diaries was that of being caged in by thunder, conveying both physical entrapment and mental imprisonment. The prolonged exposure to artillery fire led to early instances of what would later be understood as combat stress reaction or shell shock. Tremors, mutinous, panic, and obsessive behaviors were common. The breakdown of routine and predictability exacerbated the psychological toll. Small victories or successful counterattacks offered fleeting relief, but did little to diminish the overarching sense of dread. Commanders noted increasing desertion attempts, reluctance to advance, and insubordination, symptoms of moral erosion brought on by relentless pressure. Beyond individual effects, the morale of entire units was influenced. Cohesion faltered under continuous fire, as soldiers prioritized immediate survival over broader objectives. Leaders who could maintain composure and provide reassurance helped preserve discipline, but even the strongest units were tested to their limits. The bombardments, by design and effect, turned human endurance into a decisive factor in the outcome of battles. Artillery left a lasting mark on those who survived. Beyond physical scars, soldiers carried memories of incessant noise, shaking ground, and the constant presence of death. Letters and post-war memoirs reflect a mixture of fear, awe, and bitter resignation. Many described the front as a place where the earth itself seemed angry, or a sky that rained steel without pause. These descriptions reveal not just horror, but an acute awareness of the scale and power of modern warfare. The cultural impact extended beyond individual soldiers. Families, communities, and the broader German public received reports, photographs, and propaganda emphasizing both the bravery of troops and the devastating power of enemy artillery. The bombardments became a symbol of a new kind of war, mechanized, impersonal, and overwhelming. Soldiers' experiences, shared through letters or oral testimony, contributed to a collective memory of fear, endurance, and resilience that defined the German wartime experience on the Eastern Front. These angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy strategy, and moral, reveal a complex picture of artillery's impact. The psychological, physical, and strategic dimensions intertwined, culminating in moments where all elements converged into decisive action. The stage was set for the climax. The battles where artillery's relentless power would tip the scales, define outcomes, and leave an indelible mark on those who survived. March 1944. On the frozen plains near the Dnieper River, the German Ninth Army braced itself for a barrage unlike any before. Soviet artillery had been massing in concealed positions for weeks, their observers plotting trajectories, mapping the terrain, and coordinating hundreds of guns to strike simultaneously. At dawn, the first shells fell. The earth shook violently, the sky blackened with smoke and dust, and trees were torn apart as if by invisible hands. In those first few minutes, entire supply routes were obliterated, forward trenches reduced to craters, and defensive emplacements shredded. German soldiers, many of them recently rotated to the front, froze in disbelief. They had trained for enemy fire, but the scale was overwhelming. One sergeant recorded in his diary, "The world around us disappeared under the roar." Each impact was a judgment we could not escape. Officers attempted to rally the men, shouting orders over the cacophony, but the sound of constant detonations made coordination nearly impossible. Signals were drowned out, runners were cut down by fragments, and morale teetered on the edge of collapse. The bombardment was methodical. Soviet batteries alternated between high-explosive and fragmentation shells, creating overlapping zones of destruction. Mines and pre-registered barges were timed to anticipate German repositioning. Artillery was synchronized with infantry reconnaissance and armored units, ensuring that even attempts to dig in or move laterally exposed soldiers to further danger. The effect was psychological as well as physical. Panic spread in waves. Units became disjointed, unable to maintain coherent lines, and soldiers reported an almost hypnotic terror, where the only instinct left was to survive the next explosion. Amid the chaos, German counter-battery fire was mounted, but with limited effect. Observation posts, often destroyed in the opening minutes, could not accurately direct return fire. Ammunition stocks were depleted faster than they could be replenished, and the frozen terrain made it difficult to maneuver heavy guns. The Soviets' careful rotation of batteries ensured that their firing power remained continuous. For hours, the bombardment continued with relentless precision, demonstrating the culmination of artillery's evolution into a strategic weapon capable of reshaping the battlefield before infantry even engaged. By midday, the German defensive line had begun to fracture. Units that had held together for weeks were now isolated, their communication severed, and their positions compromised by cratered ground and destroyed fortifications. Soldiers described the landscape as unrecognizable. Trenches obliterated, frozen rivers churned into slush by shell impacts, and smoke obscuring any sense of direction. Attempts to regroup were met with renewed barges, forcing men to abandon heavy weapons and scramble for makeshift cover. The concept of a cohesive front had dissolved. Survival dictated every movement. Leadership faced impossible choices. Commanders could either risk further losses by attempting to hold positions or order retreats through areas saturated with shell fire. Some attempted small counterattacks to regain territory, only to be thrown back by precise artillery barges. Reports highlight the agony of officers forced to witness their men fall not to hand-to-hand combat, but to an impersonal, overwhelming force raining from the sky. In many cases, the frontline experience became one of isolated pockets of resistance, each unit fighting independently under an ever-present barrage. The culmination of these hours of shelling had tangible effects on both morale and strategy. German soldiers described a sense of fatalism. No action seemed sufficient to avert destruction. Communications with higher command revealed fragmented information. Reports came in sporadically, sometimes only hours later, and often depicted situations far worse than anticipated. Soviet forces, in contrast, maintained tight coordination between artillery, infantry, and armor, exploiting the psychological and physical chaos they had sown. By evening, the first phase of the offensive had achieved its purpose. German units were disorganized, defensive positions abandoned or destroyed, and critical supply lines severed. Survivors huddled in shattered foxholes, shaken, exhausted, and acutely aware of their vulnerability. The artillery had not merely reduced enemy positions. It had broken the rhythm of the German army, disrupted planning, and demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of concentrated, continuous fire. As night fell, the thunder of artillery subsided only marginally, replaced by sporadic shelling and the distant echoes of Soviet reconnaissance. Soldiers, still clinging to their lives, understood the lesson. Artillery was no longer just a tool of support. It was the decisive instrument of war. The human, tactical, and technological elements converged into a single overwhelming reality, setting the stage for the next phase of combat and sealing the psychological impact on the German army. As March 17th progressed into the evening, the German Ninth Army struggled to regain cohesion. The initial shock of the artillery barrage had left entire regiments disoriented, their lines fractured by craters and debris. Small pockets of resistance tried to hold key positions along the Dnieper, but the Soviets, anticipating this, intensified their fire in those sectors. The precision of the bombardment was evident. No area remained untouched, and no retreat route was truly safe. Survivors later recounted the sensation of being trapped in a world of explosions, where each movement carried the risk of instant annihilation. Soviet infantry began coordinated advances behind creeping barges. The Germans, weakened by fatigue and terror, mounted desperate counterattacks, attempting to reclaim lost trenches and hold vital crossroads. Yet these efforts were repeatedly blunted. Heavy guns, including 152mm howitzers, targeted assembly points even before soldiers could form ranks. Katyusha rocket barges struck from unexpected angles, the howling of the rockets preceding a rain of shrapnel that tore through frozen fields and shattered morale. By nightfall, German units were forced into retreat under the cover of darkness, abandoning equipment, supplies, and, in many cases, comrades too injured or demoralized to move. Leadership decisions became acute tests of endurance and judgment. Corps commanders faced the impossible: to hold territory and risk annihilation, or to withdraw and concede strategic ground. Communication remained intermittent. Radio lines had been cut by the bombardments, and runners often failed to reach frontline positions. Commanders resorted to approximations and on-the-spot judgments, relying on the initiative of junior officers and the experience of seasoned NCOs. Despite these efforts, the Soviets' overwhelming firepower and meticulous planning rendered many decisions moot. German units, even when following orders perfectly, could not escape the reach of coordinated artillery. Casualties were staggering. Reports from March 17th to 19th indicate that some regiments lost nearly 40% of their effective strength in just 3 days. Tanks immobilized in crater terrain were destroyed or abandoned. Transport vehicles were shredded under shell fire. Medical evacuation routes were blocked or obliterated. Survivors were often forced to crawl across snow and mud to reach temporary safety, exposed to sporadic shelling. The battlefield became a patchwork of chaos. Men huddled in foxholes, artillery craters filled with water and blood, and equipment littered every direction. The human toll extended beyond the physical. Soldiers reported an almost hypnotic fear during the bombardments, a paralysis that accompanied each incoming shell. Diaries recount men counting seconds between detonations, whispering prayers, and clinging to the fragile sense of camaraderie that remained. Officers struggled to maintain discipline, often shouting orders that were drowned by the roar of explosions. Some units collapsed entirely under the pressure, surrendering when faced with the impossibility of continuing the fight. Others fought tenaciously, but only to delay the inevitable. Soviet planners had achieved their objective. Not only had they broken the German front lines, but they had shattered the psychological resolve of the defenders. German troops realized that no amount of training or experience could entirely mitigate the effect of sustained, overwhelming artillery. What had begun as a tactical bombardment evolved into a strategic operation designed to disrupt command, destroy morale, and dictate the pace of battle. Survivors would later describe the operation as a storm that consumed everything, leaving only silence afterward, a silence filled with loss, exhaustion, and disbelief. By March 20th, the immediate phase of the offensive concluded with the Soviets securing key crossings along the Dnieper and establishing footholds that German forces could not reclaim. The Ninth Army had retreated to secondary defensive positions, its strength and morale diminished. Commanders conducted emergency reorganizations, attempting to plug gaps and stabilize the line, but the relentless psychological and material impact of the artillery lingered. Soldiers remained haunted by the memory of continuous explosions, the fear of unseen shells, and the sheer unpredictability of survival. In tactical terms, the battle marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. German defensive doctrine, which had relied on disciplined, entrenched positions, was shown to be vulnerable to sustained, methodical artillery campaigns. The combination of precise targeting, volume of fire, and integration with infantry and armor demonstrated a new paradigm in modern warfare, where the battlefield could be dominated without direct engagement, and victory could be achieved as much through endurance and psychological attrition as through maneuver and firepower. As night fell and temporary quiet returned to the shattered front, survivors counted the cost. Equipment abandoned, comrades lost, and positions ceded. These were tangible consequences. Equally significant, however, were the intangible effects: shaken morale, frayed discipline, and the growing awareness that in modern war, artillery could dictate both strategy and human will. The stage was now set for the aftermath, where the true consequences of unrelenting firepower will be measured not just in territory, but in lives, morale, and the evolution of military thought. The first light after the bombardment revealed a landscape unrecognizable to the men who had defended it. Trenches lay in ruins, punctuated by craters that swallowed equipment and men alike. Snow and mud mixed with blood, creating a grim tableau of destruction that stretched as far as the eye could see. German soldiers emerged from their foxholes, trembling, disoriented, and exhausted. Many counted their surviving comrades, noting the stark absence of those who had been killed, wounded, or missing during the relentless artillery onslaught. Reports from the front indicated that some units had suffered casualties exceeding 40% of their effective strength in just 3 days, a staggering loss by any measure. The immediate tactical consequences were severe. Key positions along the Dnieper and surrounding sectors were lost, forcing the German Ninth Army to withdraw to secondary defensive lines. Abandoned artillery, vehicles, and supplies littered the battlefield, creating logistical challenges for any attempt at reorganization. Communication lines had been obliterated, and medical units struggled to reach the wounded. Soldiers described crawling through cratered terrain to reach temporary safety, often under sporadic shellfire, a journey that compounded physical and psychological trauma. Morale, already strained by months of defensive operations, took a profound hit. Diaries and letters from the period reveal recurring phrases: "The ground trembles with fear, the sky rains death, and we are alive only by luck." Officers attempted to rally their men, emphasizing discipline and duty, yet the pervasive sense of helplessness undermined authority. Some units experienced localized panic, instances of temporary insubordination, and in rare cases, surrender. The psychological impact of continuous bombardment had proven as decisive as the physical destruction of positions and equipment. From a broader strategic perspective, the battle reinforced the dominance of artillery as a shaping force in modern warfare. The Soviets had demonstrated that concentrated, sustained fire could achieve objectives even before infantry engaged, reducing the effectiveness of entrenched defensive doctrines. Counter-battery fire, while attempted, had little effect against the depth and coordination of Soviet artillery placement. Even when German units attempted counterattacks or defensive improvisations, the constant shelling forced them into reactive rather than proactive operations. Commanders recognized that traditional defensive lines were increasingly vulnerable to coordinated firepower, forcing reconsideration of tactics across the front. Medical and logistical challenges further compounded the aftermath. Wounded soldiers were often immobilized in craters or destroyed trenches, delaying treatment for hours or even days. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, as transport routes had been destroyed and snow-covered roads slowed evacuation. Ammunition shortages, exacerbated by the loss of supply vehicles, left units ill-prepared for follow-up engagements. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair damaged roads, bridges, and defensive structures, yet Soviet artillery continued to target these efforts, prolonging disruption and uncertainty. The environmental impact was also undeniable. Forests were reduced to stumps, villages flattened, and farmland churned into mud and ice. The altered terrain made movement hazardous and visibility limited, creating tactical challenges for both retreating and advancing units. Soldiers faced the constant reminder that artillery was not only a weapon against men, but against the very land they occupied. In psychological terms, the human cost was as tangible as the physical. Survivors spoke of sleepless nights, persistent fear, and the haunting memory of explosions echoing in frozen silence. Letters home frequently attempted to convey the horror, but many described a sensation that words could scarcely capture, the omnipresent, unrelenting force that seemed to control life itself. Officers reported difficulties maintaining cohesion, emphasizing that even disciplined soldiers were pushed to the limits of endurance. The cumulative effect of these losses, territorial, material, and human, underscored a sobering reality. Artillery had evolved into a decisive instrument, capable of dictating outcomes not just through destruction, but by eroding morale and willpower. German forces were left weakened, both physically and mentally, as the stage was set for longer-term consequences that would ripple across strategy, leadership, and the broader war effort. In the weeks following the relentless artillery onslaught, the German Ninth Army struggled to stabilize its positions. The immediate retreat had left gaps in the defensive line, forcing commanders to reallocate scarce troops to reinforce weakened sectors. Units were often pulled from quieter sectors or reserves, but these measures were insufficient to restore full combat effectiveness. German high command recognized that continuous artillery barrages could dictate the tempo of operations, leaving even the most experienced commanders reacting to enemy initiative rather than asserting their own. The strategic implications extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Key supply routes disrupted by the bombardments slowed reinforcements and resupply, affecting operations along the entire front. Armor divisions were hindered by cratered roads and frozen terrain, reducing their mobility and firepower. Artillery's ability to render defensive positions untenable without direct engagement forced the Germans to reconsider the traditional reliance on entrenched lines and positional warfare. Reports from Corps-level headquarters highlighted an emerging understanding. In modern war, morale and endurance could be as decisive as numerical strength. Psychological and moral consequences remain profound. Soldiers endured a lingering sense of vulnerability, acutely aware that a single barrage could annihilate positions in minutes. Letters and diary entries describe men struggling to maintain composure, haunted by the memory of shattered landscapes and the screams of fallen comrades. Officers worked tirelessly to rebuild cohesion, but the damage to morale was not easily repaired. Discipline remained, but the fear instilled by sustained artillery had reshaped the soldiers' perception of combat. Survival, rather than aggression or initiative, became the central objective. On the operational level, artillery's effectiveness forced German commanders to revise tactics. Counter-battery strategies were emphasized, reconnaissance efforts intensified, and fortifications adapted to better absorb shock and shrapnel. Yet, despite these measures, the sheer volume and coordination of Soviet artillery often overwhelmed defensive adaptations. The bombardments demonstrated the importance of depth, redundancy, and flexibility in defensive planning, lessons that would influence operations for the remainder of the war. The human cost was echoed in medical and logistical records. Field hospitals reported overcapacity, and evacuation delays contributed to increased mortality among the wounded. Engineers struggled to repair roads, bridges, and fortifications under ongoing shelling, highlighting the vulnerability of support infrastructure to sustain firepower. These cumulative effects underscored that artillery was not merely a tool of frontline engagement, but a force capable of shaping entire campaigns. Beyond the front lines, propaganda and public perception were affected. German media attempted to portray resilience and heroism, emphasizing soldiers' endurance under fire. Yet first-hand accounts told a different story. Continuous bombardment eroded confidence, instilled fear, and created a pervasive sense of helplessness. Soldiers who survived these experiences carried psychological scars that persisted long after the cessation of hostilities. Veterans would later recount nightmares, heightened startle responses, and an enduring sensitivity to loud noises, silent reminders of the omnipresent artillery storm. The strategic lesson was stark. Artillery had transcended its traditional role as a supporting weapon. Its ability to destroy terrain, equipment, and human will rendered entrenched positions vulnerable and forced commanders to adapt in real time. German forces were compelled into a reactive posture, defensive operations dictated by enemy fire rather than initiative. The experience reshaped operational thinking, highlighting the integration of firepower, mobility, and morale management as critical components of modern warfare. As the front stabilized, the German army faced a sobering reality. The battlefield had changed irrevocably. Artillery was no longer merely a complement to infantry and armor. It had become a decisive instrument capable of shaping outcomes, dictating tempo, and imposing psychological dominance. Soldiers and commanders alike understood that endurance under bombardment, cohesion in chaos, and the capacity to adapt quickly were as essential as any tactical maneuver. The human, tactical, and technological consequences of these campaigns would resonate far beyond the frozen plains, shaping the conduct of warfare and the experience of those caught in its path. The thunder of artillery has always carried more than just physical force. It carries the weight of fear, endurance, and human fragility. On the frozen plains of the Eastern Front, German soldiers learned this truth in the most uncompromising terms. The bombardments did not merely destroy trenches or equipment. They reshaped the human experience of war. Every crater, every shattered tree, every echoing explosion became a testament to the unyielding power of modern firepower and the limits of human resilience. Yet within the chaos, there was a quiet testament to survival. Soldiers endured, huddled in foxholes, moving through shattered terrain and clinging to camaraderie in the face of relentless destruction. Their endurance, born of necessity, reflected both the fragility and the stubborn strength of the human spirit. Even in moments of despair, there was action, decision-making, and a determination to persist against forces that seemed absolute. In this, the battlefield became a crucible, shaping not only the outcome of operations, but the very character of those who experienced it. The events on the Eastern Front also reveal the evolution of warfare. Artillery, once a supporting element, had transformed into a decisive instrument capable of dictating the tempo, strategy, and psychology of entire armies. Its capacity to break lines without direct engagement, to erode morale, and to impose a rhythm of terror reshaped military thinking. Commanders, soldiers, and strategists were forced to confront a new reality. Victory depended not just on numbers or bravery, but on endurance, adaptability, and the management of fear itself. History remembers battles in terms of territory gained or lost, of objectives achieved or missed. But the true legacy of relentless artillery lies in its human dimension. The soldiers who lived through it carry the memory of a war defined by sound and vibration, by anticipation and terror, by moments when survival outweighed all else. Their experience serves as a reminder that in warfare, the most powerful weapons are often those that cannot be seen, only felt through trembling earth, ringing ears, and hearts that refuse to cease beating despite the storm overhead. In the end, the artillery storm was more than a military tactic. It was a force that tested humanity itself, leaving a permanent imprint on the soldiers, the strategy, and the history of war.